What's up, travelers? SummationKid here. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the controversial censorship shenanigans that Zenless Zone Zero is going through. And if you haven't, you have now. For those of you who are out of the loop, Zenless Zone Zero is an upcoming gacha game made by miHoYo, now called Hoyoverse, who are also the makers of Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail, and the old Honkai Impact 3rd. Now, in the second closed beta of Zenless Zone Zero, a lot of players noticed quite a few changes to some of the characters and scenes and dialogue, which were mostly unwelcome and widely considered to be censorship. And while I agree with the general sentiment, I do think a lot of the anger and complaints are kind of misdirected, so that's why I made this video to clear things up. First of all, since Hoyoverse is a Chinese company, they are subject to Chinese laws. And China has notoriously strict laws around video games and censorship, as most of us know. Historically, a way that developers got around this was to make two different versions of a game, one for the China market and one for the rest of the world. My favorite example, World of Warcraft. Yes, they changed skulls into sacks of grain. The thing is, these are all foreign companies who are creating a separate version of their game for the China market, while Hoyoverse is a Chinese company. Now, the Chinese government doesn't really care about this distinction, at least when it comes to video games. It is actually the Chinese player base that's causing miHoYo to behave this way. Let me explain. From the perspective of Chinese gamers, they can't really expect foreign companies to change their entire game just for China. So it's more acceptable for foreign companies to make a China version of the game that is frankly a bit watered down in order to comply with Chinese laws so they can have their game released in China. However, because Hoyoverse is a Chinese company, then a lot of Chinese players believe that they should prioritize the Chinese player base. Put another way, they believe that international gamers shouldn't get a better product than Chinese gamers get from a Chinese company. And we kind of saw this kind of belief and sentiment on display back during Honkai Impact 3rd. So this was back when they were still called miHoYo and they were trying to do a bunny skin kind of event for the characters in Honkai Impact 3rd. Now, they were prohibited from doing this in China, but they figured they could still do this for the international audience. However, the Chinese gamers kicked up a huge fuss over this, claiming that miHoYo was turning its backs on the Chinese player base, which were the ones who initially made them successful. So in the end, because Chinese gamers were unhappy that the rest of the world was getting something that they weren't getting from a Chinese company, then they sort of forced that company to cancel the event for the international audience as well. Now, there is one notable counterexample to this, and that's when Hoyoverse was forced to censor some characters in Genshin Impact. What happened then was that some feminists in China mass-reported miHoYo to the Chinese government, who then ordered miHoYo to make some changes to some of the characters. As a result, we got some censored skins of a few characters like Amber, Rosaria, Mona, and Fischl. Now, the interesting thing that makes this a counterexample to the whole bunny event from Honkai Impact 3rd is that the international version of Genshin Impact was allowed to keep the original skins of these characters as an option, whereas only the Chinese client was forced to use the new, updated, censored skins. I suspect that because the difference between the skins wasn't really that different, so they didn't really censor much of anything. I think it was more of, we have to do something because the government told us to. So that's why Chinese players probably weren't as upset about that as with the bunny event from Honkai Impact 3rd. But I would wager that as a big company, Hoyoverse wants to play on the safe side and avoid angering the Chinese player base. So that is why they're not going to make two versions of the game for China and the rest of the world. Instead, they're just going to make one censored version that complies with Chinese censorship laws, and that's going to be the one version of the game that is available to everyone. And of course, I hope everyone knows that this isn't really what Hoyoverse wants, right? It's not their first choice, it's not their vision of the game, so to speak. And you know that because they initially made the pre-censored versions of everything in the first place. And they only made the decision to censor it after the fact because they were afraid from complaints by the Chinese government or the Chinese player base. So to sum things up, the reason that Hoyoverse is making all of these changes is because of very strict censorship and gaming laws in China. And the reason they can't use the most popular solution to this, which is to make two different game clients for China and for the rest of the world, is because they're afraid of backlash from the Chinese player base. So ultimately, the blame for all of this does primarily lie with the Chinese government for having such strict laws around gaming and censorship. However, to be quite frank, I do believe that at least some of the blame lies with the Chinese player base for previously sending MiHoYo the signal that they would be very upset if they perceive that a Chinese company is delivering a better product to the international player base than to the Chinese player base, even though, again, it's due to China's own laws. Now, I highly doubt that the Chinese government will change their mind on this, and I highly doubt that Hoyoverse is going to risk pissing off the Chinese government. So the best possible outcome for us is probably that Hoyoverse decides the Chinese player base won't be super pissed at them for making two different versions of the game, and they proceed to do that. Not gonna lie, the chance is looking kind of slim since the censorship changes were made from closed beta 1 to closed beta 2, but at least we can continue giving them feedback and holding out hope until the game finally releases. So I encourage all of you to submit feedback to Hoyoverse, urging them to revert or at least tone down some of the censorship. And I do want to caution everybody to not get too upset at Chinese gamers or even the Chinese government. After all, they have their reasons for doing things, even though we may not agree and we may not like the effect that it has on our waifus. As always, do remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have any thoughts to share or any new insights, be sure to leave a comment. I always love chatting with you guys in the comment section. And with that, I, SummationKid, will see you guys in the next video.